Good evening and welcome to this discussion of My Vanishing Country, a memoir, hosted by the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the University of South Carolina's College of Social Work. I am Kirk Foster, Associate Professor and Associate Dean, and I'll be the moderator and one of the panelists tonight. This event continues our efforts to engage our community in a critical look at race and racism in America, this time through the eyes of Bakari Sellers, a son of South Carolina. First, I would like to thank Dean Ron Pittner for his support of this event and Assistant Dean Victoria Montgomery and Janae Epps for their efforts in organizing everything and all the behind the scenes work. I also thank Michelle Crisp and Joe Woodard, who are coordinating the technology that makes us all look good and sound good. Tonight's format will include reflections on the book from 3 panelists, followed by a time of questions and answers. So we ask that you type your questions in the Q&A box that you can see on your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. And please don't be afraid to post some questions. We look forward to them. Also note that we will host Bakari Sellers in a virtual town hall next Thursday, February 4th at 6 to 7, using the same format. And so the questions that you ask tonight will inform the questions that we will ask him to address. So if you have not already, we encourage you to register for this upcoming event, and you can do that by visiting the College of Social Work webpage, or we'll put some information up later on. I would like to welcome our panelists, Dr. Nikki Wooten and Carla Dameron. Dr. Wooten is Associate Professor at the college here at the College of Social Work, and she's also a Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves. Dr. Wooten teaches military social work and adult psychopathology and conducts behavioral health services research on military and veteran populations. Carla Dameron is a clinical social worker, an advocate and author of the novel The Stone Necklace, the recipient of the 2017 WFWA Star Award for Best Novel. Carla served as the executive director of the NASW South Carolina chapter following a 30-plus year career in mental health. I welcome you both tonight and thank you for being with us. Tonight's order is that I will start with some reflections, and then we will hear reflections from Dr. Wooten and Carla. It was late spring 2011. The Confederate battle flag still flew on the grounds of the South Carolina State House, and my partner and I were in Columbia to look for housing after I accepted the faculty position here at the College of Social Work. Charlie and I had a custom back then, when we lived in St. Louis, of going out for breakfast every Saturday morning to the same restaurant. We developed this ritual while I was in my PhD program as a way to unwind and set aside time just for us. We enjoyed going to the same place, getting to know the staff, and becoming one of the, quote, regulars. And when we were here in Columbia, it was a sunny Saturday morning, and we set out in advance of our meeting with our real estate agent to audition potential restaurants that could become our regular Saturday morning hangout. Not knowing much about Columbia or South Carolina for that matter, because neither one of us had really spent any time here before I accepted the job, we pulled into a restaurant, excuse me, with the most unusual name, Lizard's Thicket. And so, I'll pause here for a moment so you can either cringe or cheer or clap or whatever your feelings are about the good old Lizard's Thicket, where you can get Jell-O as a vegetable. And when we walked through the door, we were greeted by a jovial white woman who was probably in her late 50s. Her slight accent suggested to me that she'd spent many years, if not her whole life, here in South Carolina. Charlie and I bantered with her, as had become our custom as Saturday morning restaurant staff, and I'm not sure exactly how the conversation evolved, but I vividly recall her admonishing us as Northerners for the, quote, "no war of Northern aggression." She walked away from our table, likely without comprehending the bomb that she dropped in the middle of our morning and how she would shape our early perceptions of life here in Columbia, South Carolina. And I'm sure I had a blank stare on my face as she spoke to us about this war. My mind raced to understand the reference. I'd spent my entire life in the St. Louis metropolitan area, which has its own storied history with race relations. And I'm a product of small Southern Illinois public schools, also not a bastion of progressive thought, though I did have some really good examples. In that moment, my mind searched to contextualize this war of which she spoke for what seemed like minutes, but was likely seconds. I had no reference for it, perhaps because I refused to let that interpretation live in my memory. And I finally looked across the table at Charlie and said, "Did she just call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression?" And he shook his head yes. And that became one of our early introductions to living in South Carolina and our last breakfast at Lizard's Thicket. Bakari Sellers shared with us an excerpt from his father's middle school South Carolina history book. This historical note on Reconstruction read, quote, "There were many more Negroes than whites in the state. They did not know how to make a living without the supervision of the white man. They were not willing to work. There were so many more Negroes than whites that they would have been in control if they had been allowed to vote. They nearly ruined the state during the years they voted. The whites were determined this should not happen again. Regulations were made to prevent Negroes from voting. To this day, South Carolina is a white man's government." Taught in the South Carolina history books through the 1960s, this, as Bakari Sellers suggests, is the historical narrative that shaped generations. A narrative that in 2021, or at least for me a decade ago when I sat at that table that morning in the Lizard's Thicket, we would like to believe this narrative had faded like the setting sun. A narrative that paints African Americans, as Sellers notes, something less than human. Bakari Sellers quotes himself in the book from a CNN, I think it was a CNN interview that he gave just after, in the wake, in the days, the moments, the hours after Dylann Roof murdered 9 people at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And the quote he shared with us in the book is this: "If I could not," he says, "I could not understand how someone who's only 21 years old, born in the 90s, could have the same mindset and outlook of racists of the 50s and 60s. Yet what we see even today, in the moments when our state legislators argued against removing the Confederate battle flag from the State House grounds in 2015, after that massacre at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, that narrative from that history book lived. The narrative lives as our statewide elected officials perpetuate the myth of a, quote, stolen presidential election, implicitly arguing that the ballots of many Black voters were not legal. It lives as these same elected officials refuse to acknowledge the white privilege on display January 6th as insurrectionists stormed the United States Capitol. The narrative lives in the contaminated drinking water in Bakari Sellers' hometown of Denmark, South Carolina. And it lives on the twisted dirt roads of the rural South, whose hardworking residents lack access to health care, a living wage, and quality public education. My Vanishing Country is a cathartic memoir of not only Bakari Sellers, but the lineage of many who grew up on those very dusty roads of the rural South. This vanishing country is the, quote, forgotten rural Black Belt, once known for rich farming and now known for its racialized generational poverty. A country that birthed the likes of Cleve Sellers and Nikki Haley. Bakari Sellers helps us understand that life in the Black Belt was and is filled with triumph and tragedy. I found this book to be an unfolding process of defining oneself within the context of family, history, and community. This is no different from how we all define ourselves. Bakari is from the unpredictable dirt roads of Denmark, however, on the right side of the tracks, as he notes. But even he could become the youngest person ever elected to the South Carolina legislature. His memoir is in part an example to every African American child yearning to imagine their future selves and believe they can achieve the goals they set out, regardless of if they come from the dirt roads of South Carolina or the South Side of Chicago. I read this book through what seems to me as his central mantra, his mission to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He did this by chronicling his academic struggles at Morehouse to his own battles with anxiety. And I appreciated this raw public discussion of the real mental health struggles that he faces and the weight he places on himself to be a role model to young kids who look like him. It's important to talk about mental health generally, but particularly important among Black men. Bakari notes how the anxiety can paralyze people and decimate lives. And even I say this, we cannot ignore the vicarious trauma African Americans in this country experience every day at the mere telling, the mere showing of one more African American being shot by the police. This insidious trauma has the power to deeply hurt even the strongest among us. Bakari Sellers reminds us that we live in a world of intersections. Race, religion, politics, gender, they all matter in a way that is much more than any one of them alone. He ends his book with these words: "We all deserve to be free and equal." That means clean water. That means access to healthcare. That means living wages, and that means racial justice and equity. Ending his memoir this way hit me hard as a social worker. We are advocates for racial justice. And as Bakari Sellers said of his own life, our change efforts should focus on the people who have the power to implement systems of oppression. And now I will turn it to my colleague, Nikki Wooten.
Oh, thank you, Kurt. I really enjoyed your reflections as well. My reflections are going to be based on my being a daughter of the South. My Vanishing Country is a personal memoir situated in the social cultural context of the vanishing rural South, or the Black Belt, the civil rights movement, and the idealism of a son of both the rural South, Denmark, South Carolina in particular, and the civil rights movement, who desires to make public and private impacts at the local, state, and national levels. Sellers expresses a desire to make radical social and political change against the odds of racism, small town provincialism, and hostile political ideology that pits Republicans against Democrats in the blood red state of South Carolina. With numerous advantages, unlike many sons of rural Denmark, Sellers provides personal insight about the Orangeburg Massacre, fictive kin who happened to be a who's who of the civil rights movement, and modern day politicians and social activists. As a daughter of the rural South, I'm from North Carolina, not South Carolina, I especially enjoy the easygoing, everyday vernacular and Southern euphemisms used in the memoir that makes his story relatable to any Southerner and understandable to anyone who desires to increase their knowledge of Southern culture. Sellers also did not shy away from difficult topics and disclosure of personal challenges that may stigmatize. For instance, I appreciate the courage it takes to criticize how the Black church's role in social and economic justice in the African American community has changed over time, given that he is also a son of the Black church in the South. And in his opinion, the role of the Black church has changed not for the better. He also disclosed intergenerational mental health problems of both parents, and he was very candid struggle with anxiety, how debilitating mental illness was for both himself and his mother, and his ability to manage his anxiety with counseling and medication, and his conceptualization of the overall impact anxiety has on Black men. In his memoir, he described it, for Black males, anxiety is grounded in a sense of self-directed anger and rage because our lives appear to be cyclical. To borrow from the rapper T.I., we found ourselves in a proverbial trap, from attending failing schools to suffering from poor health to seeing our loved ones gunned down. We feel like we can never get out of this trap. And he believes that some of the anger and frustration of Black men comes from not being told they are loved, and that they are not loved by the society or media, and that they cannot verbalize outside the barbershop or the locker room that they may need some help. I'm also struck by Sellers' lack of anger and bitterness towards the South, and South Carolina in particular, but a deep emotional love affair with South Carolina and a driving desire to make a difference to the lost and disenfranchised. For instance, his best friend, or the young man who spent a lot of his time at Sellers' home, practically lived with his family, but was from the other side of the tracks in Denmark, and from those who were lost too young as a result of poverty or other sorts of disadvantage. He provided eye-opening insights regarding South Carolina politics, intense political divisions between Republicans and Democrats, even going so far to say that Democrat might be considered a dirty word here in South Carolina, and the harmful political ideology and rhetoric that still lives with us today. What was most impactful was his airing of the dirty laundry of South Carolina that are both shameful and sinister, when he delved into discussions about the taking down of the Confederate flag, the historical trauma of slavery, Jim Crow, and the killing of unarmed African Americans during the Orangeburg Massacre, and how it still negatively impacts his father and South Carolinians today, as well as his poignant discussion of his father's losses as a result of going to prison. The traffic stop by the Chester County Sheriff and the resulting personal disappointment that he failed himself and also his community by putting himself in a situation where he could be stopped and later have to plead guilty to reckless driving. Being followed by a Republican tracker during his race for Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. And it's interesting that he reported being followed by the Republican tracker after being stopped by the Chester County Sheriff. it's almost like there was something left unspoken, that perhaps one had something to do with the other. He also delved into health inequities, which were part of his own personal life journey in terms of maternal morbidity and his wife Ellen's experience with being near death in childbirth, and his raw emotions after the mass shooting at Mother Emanuel, which launched his career as a CNN political analyst. I think it's also important to note that he touched on the subject of the teaching of racist ideology in Southern schools, both segregated and integrated, and how some may term this, even in a book, the miseducation of the Negro. He also delved into the topic about some have termed the browning of America, when by 2042 that the US will be a minority majority country. And he talked about how he believes that this is really what allowed President Trump to gain momentum in his campaign and during his presidency. I was most cheerful during his account of how his wife Ellen almost lost her life during childbirth, and most sorrowful to learn of the illness of his infant daughter, but joy with the knowledge of the liver transplant. I think overall this book really gives us the inside story of a son of the South. I don't think we've heard the last of Bakari Sellers' personal memoir, given what he's already experienced and what he desires to do with his life overall in terms of making a difference in South Carolina. I think he will have more to tell more in his future. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki, for those reflections. I appreciate it, especially as a daughter of the South, and like you said, a daughter of North Carolina, but still a daughter of the South. And so now we turn it over to Carla Dameron, and can't wait to hear your reflections, especially as an author. And so we look forward to your critical insight.
Thank you, Kirk. You can hear me okay, I'm assuming. Y'all are tough acts to follow. You're both pretty astounding in what you had to say. I'm really glad I got the chance to listen to you guys. I want to talk a little bit as an author, but mostly I want to talk as a social worker and a daughter of the South as well. I'm from South Carolina. I grew up in Sumter, South Carolina. So he walked land that I know. So if you haven't been to Denmark, I really would encourage you to go. It's important to see a place like Denmark and Allendale and the rural areas of Orangeburg County. That's part of the Black Belt that he described as, what's known for dark, rich soil, but he described it as a chain of connecting states, the largest thread of contiguous poverty, and a microcosm of forgotten Black South, where isolation, lack of economic development, substandard housing, and schools have devastated it to its core. I'd love to say that all of that's been fixed since he was in school, but I can't say that because those problems persist in those sections of the state. I was recently in a meeting where we discussed the digital divide in South Carolina. And there are huge swaths of South Carolina, particularly in those areas where there is no access to internet. And I'm imagining how wonderful virtual school must be if you have no access to internet. Something to think about. He also talks about Orangeburg, South Carolina, which is fascinating. Orangeburg has been the center of civil rights abuses and protests for a long time, starting in the 50s and 60s. With the Orangeburg Freedom Movement, and then of course the horrific Orangeburg Massacre that happened in '68, where 3 students died and 28 students were gunned down by state troopers. That I was alive in South Carolina then, and I don't remember much about it at the time in the media, which is kind of fascinating. It wasn't like Kent State. Kent State was blown all over the media, but what was covered in the white newspapers in South Carolina about the Orangeburg Massacre was like little footnotes. We didn't want to talk about it. We wanted to gloss it over. The governor wanted to blame it on outside agitators. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that the troopers gunned down unarmed students. No one wanted to acknowledge that. And of course, Bakari Sellers, Cleveland Sellers, was the one person that did time for that event. None of the killers did time. Bakari Sellers' father was unjustly jailed for that. In his memoir, he talks about how that land gave, how he grew up in that land and what it was like. And he talks about his family and his childhood and the strong leaders who nurtured him. He was around some pretty amazing leaders through his father who maintained a big presence in the civil rights world, but also the African-American women who nurtured him, who gave him a lot of his strength and a lot of his drive. What struck me about it is, in the memoir and in his political life, is his spirit. He has an unending belief that if he wants something, he should fight for it. And he will fight for it, you know, as long and hard as he needs to. Deciding to run for the legislature at his age was really amazing. And the lengths that he went to win that election, all the doors that he knocked on, all the relationships that he nurtured. Then later he ran for lieutenant governor, and I remember that race. He was very exhausted, I think, from knocking on all the doors in South Carolina and going to all the churches to garner some votes. And he believed he would win that election until he didn't win. And as he looks back, he can see some of his mistakes and he learns from his mistakes. But, you know, it's a pretty powerful trajectory for someone so young to have that drive to push him forward. It's pretty remarkable. Another thread in this work is him taking us from the Orangeburg Massacre through to the Mother Emanuel church shooting. That for me was really powerful, because there is the threat, the hatred and the white supremacy that caused the Orangeburg Massacre was alive and well in Dylann Roof in 2015. So in 50 years, we have not changed enough. What has changed is the media exposure. The massacre, the slaughter at the Mother Emanuel Church was all over the news. It was in our face. It was everyone in the country, in the world, see what happened, see this horrible thing that happened in our state. And that was really important. He writes beautifully and poignantly about these events and how they shaped him. He also expresses his own pain and grief in a very raw way, as he did on CNN right after that event. He was like the face of South Carolina. And it was really impressive that how honest he was about what happened and how it happened, and how we have the responsibility to keep it from happening again. It was pretty impressive. If you don't remember it, it was really pretty remarkable. He was raw and honest, sharing his pain and grief and putting this horrible event in the larger context of racism in the South. So now I want to talk a little bit, Kirk touched on the subject of mental health, and that's important to me because I worked in mental health for 7,000 years. And one of the things that, as a clinician and as an administrator, that was one of the most difficult things for us to deal with was the experience of shame in our patients. I think the opposite of hope is shame, and the opposite of healing is shame. And Bakari Sellers' willingness to talk so openly about his problems with anxiety, which began in his teens and how he related it to his fear of death and to tragedies in his life, even the Orangeburg Massacre and the effect that had on his family. His ability to explore all that openly and honestly, as though it's any other kind of problem someone might have, I think is really important. I found it quite refreshing. He used the word, the words "the weight of the torch" when he talks about the power of dealing with what African Americans deal with, and in dealing with discrimination and racism and white supremacy and all of the killings and the police killings, and how all of that weighs on him and affects him and contributes to his anxiety. He said, "Social and political pressures can make it hard for me to breathe. I go out and try to make sure that other people can breathe by revealing my fears and anxieties." And I thought he said that really well. If there is a message in his work, in this work, one, I agree with Nikki. I don't think he's done. I think, well, first, he's still young. I could see 2 or 3 more memoirs out of this dude. And he loves to write. He loves to express himself. So I can really see that happening. But he wants a different world for his children. I wonder about that, though. I wonder where the signs are that that will actually happen. The same country that elected Barack Obama elected Donald Trump. The same state that finally removed the Confederate flag. And I was there at the State House when they voted on that. And the only reason that happened was because of the Mother Emanuel Church. That's why that was finally the one thing that said, okay, we've got to acknowledge this. And while it was powerful and wonderful and a shining moment in my life to see that flag come down, too many people thought that was the answer, and it is not the answer. It's a step towards the answer, but we have so much further to go. The same state that finally removed the Confederate flag also refused Medicaid expansion dollars that would have saved many lives, many of whom are minorities, not to mention preventing the closure of hospitals in poorer regions of the state, including Bamberg, which is the county where he's from, where Bakari Sellers is from. So, and other health disparities that we're dealing with related to the coronavirus. I haven't seen the specific research to South Carolina, but nationally we're seeing a trend that access to vaccines is happening more to Caucasian people than to minorities. While the vaccine while the virus is much crueler to minorities than it is to Caucasian people. So we have a long way to go. How do we sustain our hope despite the evidence that things are so hard to get people to change, to get things to change? Sellers is not afraid to ask this question. He speaks truth to power. Whether on the page or on camera, he's in our face. His pain is raw as it was the days after the assassination of Clementa Pinckney, when he says, "We will not bow down, we will stand up." He also says, "I have much more work to do in South Carolina. We are not there yet." Well, I would say that we as social workers have the same mission. Social justice is a part of who we are. It's part of the code of ethics. We must also be thinking of these issues and looking at ways that we can impact them in whatever role in our lives that we're playing. For him, he says it means he wants to see freedom from discrimination, including the ballot box, freedom from violence, from domestic terrorism that took Clem Pinckney to the violence at the hands of the police. And I would say the violence we saw at the National Capitol recently. Freedom to live in communities where our children are not drinking water that contains lead, that have hospitals and safe neighborhoods and equal schools, economic opportunity, and entrepreneurship. He has his work cut out for him to fight for these things, but we do too. His message is a message we need to hear because we need to be reminded that it's our job to fight this battle. Thanks.
Thanks, Carla, for those great comments and thoughts on this particular, on Bakari's book and his own writing and thinking. So this is a time where we're happy to entertain some questions from you who are joining us in the audience tonight. There are a couple of questions up here, and Nikki may have some, and Carla may have some, and I've certainly jotted some down as well. The first question that was posted about the Black church, actually, I had in my original notes to talk about this, as I call the lament that Bakari writes, this lament of the Black church. And for those of you who don't know, I was a local church pastor for 10 years, And a lot of my research has centered around how African Americans in urban neighborhoods leverage the resources in local churches for their own social and economic development. And so I appreciate this question that Janae writes. What are your thoughts on the changing role and the impact of the Black church on the community? And even in my own thinking about this, that I found very interesting or very intriguing Bakari's lament of the Black church, that it was no longer this place for progressive ideas, necessarily for progressive politics, as it was during the civil rights era. At least in his experience of it, it's lost that place, it's lost that flavor. And I really, throughout that whole chapter where he's talking about his run for lieutenant governor, it just struck me that the subtext of that is he was really hoping that the Black church could be what it was, for his father back in the 1960s. And so, yeah, I'll stop my comments there and ask Nikki and Carla if you want to jump in.
Yes, thanks, Kirk. I appreciate that question as well. And I went back, I highlighted this passage as I was reading the book, and he talks about being very disappointed with the church and how it's now more of a hollowed out mega churches where pastors are thirsty more for social fame than for social justice. And I think there's a proverbial question in the African American communities whether or not the church is now doing more harm than Bakari also tells the Black church now is more passive and insular when it comes to social justice issues, and I would say even insular when it comes to socioeconomic status, where some people feel they are ostracized or socially isolated from the protection and the society of the church, like the social activities of the church. And in terms of the Black church doing more harm and good, there have been a lot of sensationalized accusations in the news in recent times that would make some individuals definitely stray away from the church and even make them question its legitimacy. First and foremost that came to mind was Pastor Eddie Long, Bishop Eddie Long, and the controversy regarding his abuse of young African-American men who came to the church seeking assistance, and in their vulnerability that he violated their trust in some way. Also recently, you have Creflo Dollar and the controversy regarding the jet he wanted his church to purchase for him. And even just more recently, in the last few months, you have Jamal Bryant, who's now the pastor of New Birth, where Pastor Eddie Long was, and the controversy with the Housewives of Potomac, and whether or not, his inability to maintain his moral compass, so to speak, and whether or not the rekindling of the relationship with his ex-wife is more for the show than realistic. And I think some of those things, and a lot of these things played out in rare form on social media, mainstream media. I mean, you could probably Google it now and search YouTube, and you will still be able to go back and get chronicles of the history of these controversies. And I think it's how society has changed over time in terms of social media, that I would even say the dirty laundry of the Black church has come to the forefront, and perhaps made even larger society, particularly millennials, to question its legitimacy. Whereas in previous times, you probably wouldn't find people in the South, in the Bible Belt, so to speak, ever questioning the legitimacy of the Black church, because most people were raised in the church and revered it. And anyone who graced the pulpit was thought to be, quote, speaking the gospel. And oftentimes you got your political messages from the pulpit as well. And every politician visited the well-known African-American churches in your community, which still happens today, but I think the church has definitely lost some of its legitimacy.
I wonder too about pastors holding elected office and how, you know, then they've got their own agenda, their own political agenda that might make this kind of thing more difficult. Oh,
definitely. Carla, Pastor Wardlaw comes to mind. Who just won a Senate seat. Senate seat at that.
Yeah, and there are, you know, very clear federal IRS guidelines that govern the kinds of political messages that can come from the pulpit. I remember, so my ministerial standing is in the United Church of Christ, and then Senator Barack Obama was a member of a very large African American United Church of Christ congregation in Chicago under Pastor Jeremiah Wright, who himself became controversial for a number of things. You know, and so our church invited, you know, our denomination invited then Senator Barack Obama to speak on how he understood the intersection of faith and politics, and faith and public service. This was before he announced his candidacy for president. And the IRS, and I'm not going to say that it was politically motivated, who knows, it probably could have been, began investigating the church because it said we were violating this clause, you know, in the IRS code, so we may jeopardize our 501c3, our nonprofit status as a religious body. So, you know, so there are very clear guidelines, and so I don't know if that's impacting, you know, I won't pretend to know. I do see on the screen, I don't know, Nikki and Carla, if you see it, a question from a MSW student at Johnson C. Smith University up in Charlotte. So welcome all of those students who are joining us tonight, either from our college here at the University of South Carolina or elsewhere. I do know that we've got some from Johnson C. Smith, obviously. And so this particular student notes that they were born and raised in the North, and then asked this question about whether or not this lack of concern for the community, right? So I might interpret that as lack of concern for social justice issues and maybe racial equity and equality was worse in the South than it is in the North, or perhaps maybe they're just not looking at the right churches right now. So I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that question. What I can say is it definitely varies from congregation to congregation. The first church that I served was in Ferguson, Missouri, and it's certainly, and this was in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, and even then, it was certainly a challenge among this mostly white congregation in a rapidly changing community to think critically, about what it meant to be in that space. A lot of good folks there, loved my time there. A lot of people asking great questions, but when you think about the message then that's coming perhaps from the pulpit versus, from individual voices, there are some clergy who don't feel that necessarily the pulpit is that place. But I can say that many of us, I put myself in that group, speak often about social justice issues from the pulpit, and try and advance that beloved community notion.
I would not belong to a church that did not have a social justice focus. That was what was involved when I was picking my church. That was the most important thing. And I'm pleased with what we do. I will say this though, while we're integrated, we are 90% people that look like me. And that's one area where it's, I don't see really fully integrated 50-50 churches in the South. I would love to see it. It's kind of fascinating to me.
Oh, that's an excellent point, Carla, because they say that 11 o'clock hour is the most segregated hour in the U.S., particularly in the South. Now it's probably between 8 and 12. But I'd like to tackle the question from the student at Johnson C. Smith, because I am a daughter of the Southern Black Church. Both my parents are leaders in the church, and my first Bible verse was Jesus wept. So I probably was in every Sunday school class in my church. And I moved to the North, and so I've been members of churches in Maryland and in Boston, Massachusetts. And when I moved back here, I wanted a church that was near my house, because I feel very strongly about being involved in ministries and community activities of the church. And also, when I look for a house, I'm looking for a church at the same time. The realtor has to ride me by churches also in the area. So that was important to me. But I must say, I think maybe the differences that are seen in Northern Black churches are a result of the Great Migration. I think a lot of African Americans, they definitely left the South to get away from all that they saw that was negative about the South, the discrimination. You do have some churches in the North that are political and social activists. And so I think to me, there are not many differences, and perhaps that's because I look for similar churches, because I am a daughter of the Black Southern Church. But I have visited a number of churches when I lived up north, and there are some that are very insular and exclusive and passive, and definitely seen that they're focused on, who attends, what the socioeconomic status is of who attends that church, and very much vested in that reputation. And so you may feel like they're focused on tithes and offerings, but I have searched to find some in the North that are not that way so much. And so I think you have to be very selective. I think some people feel that definitely the message has been watered down, and the focus has changed from just traditional religion to more social justice issues. And I think we have to be, as individuals, have to be very clear about what we seek and desire from a place of worship. And I think we will make better choices. But there are sometimes definitely where you're disappointed with churches, whether you're in the South or the North. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily an issue of North and South, but perhaps it is a result of the Great Migration and some Southerners trying to get away from all that was the Black church represented in the South. And so there may be different atmospheres, social and political atmospheres of churches in the North.
Great, yeah, thanks for that, Nikki. Rebecca asked a question about if there's a list of churches out there that are anti-racist and actively working towards social justice causes. I don't know of a list, and that varies so much from church to church, and you may learn from websites. Usually churches who are really out in the forefront on social justice issues are proud of that and post that on their web pages.
And I found here in the South that they tend to be more non-denominational churches, where they're more innovative and creative, even how they orchestrate their service. And you might find that they're more racially, ethnically diverse. There's not that traditional dressing up. You come as you are. They may not even have the traditional times for a church. They may have church early in the morning, afternoon, to accommodate the work schedules of all. And I think some of those churches are, particularly non-denominational, might be more radical in their message and more inclusive also.
So I'm going to switch topics. And this comes actually from something you said, Carla, that I think is worth pushing, either from our read of this particular book or from our own experience. And Carla, you said that as you were living here in Sumter, South Carolina, at the time of the Orangeburg massacre, it was almost as a footnote, and that racism here has been treated as a footnote. And what I noted from the book in how Bakari describes the governor's reaction to the Orangeburg massacre is very similar to the way many of our elected leaders today talk about and are talking about the insurrection at the Capitol, or talking about other types of protests, maybe what happened in Charlottesville and the like, where they say it's really outside agitators. It wasn't our people, it was outside agitators. And I was really struck, I hadn't thought about it in that way. I was really struck, Carla, when you said that, racism is a footnote. So, I mean, can you explore that a little bit more with us and your own experience and your thinking? And, Nikki, if you want to chime in after that too.
I don't think racism itself is a footnote. It's just that when something big happens, we don't want attention. We don't want people to see it. We didn't want people to see what happened in Orangeburg. The governor especially did not want a lot of attention for that. Martin Luther King wrote a letter to LBJ about the Orangeburg massacre. So in the African American world, in the civil rights world, this was a huge deal. But in the white world, it was like, no, that was just, they were acting up. We had to contain them. They were outside. There were people from the north that came to fuel the fire. Everything that happened had to happen. That was just sort of our stance in white South Carolina. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. Well, one, why did the Orangeburg massacre happen? It happened because it was 3 or 4 African-American students from SC State dared to enter a bowling alley that was a white bowling alley, right? The Civil Rights Act had passed, but just because it passed didn't mean we were going to actually believe it down here in South Carolina. We were going to do our own thing, and we were going to have our own rules. And so they actually dared to go into a bowling alley, and that led to fights and protests and a swelling of protests and a swelling of energy. And then the National Guard was brought in and state troopers were brought in. There was tremendous fear in the white government about this. We've got to contain this. We've got to squelch it, and then we've got to put it behind us. That was the thrust. The reality is those kids had every right to go into that bowling alley. They had every right to do it. And that the statement they were making was a non-violent statement. But what happened, of course, was tremendously violent.
Yeah, thanks for that. Nikki, did you have anything? I mean, you don't necessarily have to, but.
It struck me when you recalled Kama's statement about racism being a footnote. It made me remember one of the things that Bakari pointed out in the book was that racism is rooted in politics, religion, education, and access to healthcare in the South. So it's a constant thread to all that Southerners hold dear in the South. That's what it made me recall.
People don't like change. Humankind fights change. And this is one change that has been, we're still fighting. We're still fighting it. It's absurd, but we're still fighting it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that leads me to my next comment and where my, Carla, as you were just talking about it again, it reminds me of something that Bakari said in his book, and that is people continue to vote against their own interests because the plight of the rural white person is similar to the plight of the rural African American. Why then, right? So Bakari poses this to us. Why then do people continue to vote against their interests? And what he's arguing here is that why would they vote for a Republican representative or a Republican senator who has, or someone, as he again, as he also lamented the career politicians who are in it only for social gain and the endless supply of free food, I guess, and not for the change that he himself went into the state legislature to make. You know, so people continue to vote for those who don't have their best interests at heart. And I wonder if some of this isn't rooted in these footnotes, right? I like that imagery. You know, some of it isn't rooted in these footnotes. I don't know if either one of you have any reactions to that.
If you just look at the Medicaid expansion that we fought so hard for, why did we not have Medicaid expansion in South Carolina?
Political
One reason. It was because it was an Obama policy.
Right.
And it was one Obama policy we could reject, even though it was shooting us ourselves in the foot over and over and over again. And we've just elected a very conservative Republican legislature. So we're looking forward to a lot of legislation that's going to be in everybody's bad interest.
I believe it's political ideology. This is the way I've always voted. This is where my grandparents voted. And I'm going to continue along that same trend, which is that thread that's rooted in racism, which is ingrained in the political ideology of the South. And it's also somewhat of a interesting dichotomy, because in the midst of this pandemic, we've seen all these health disparities just blaring on our TV. That we get the message almost every day, all day, about the disparities, the increasing rates here in South Carolina in particular. I think over the last month or so, the positivity rate was like 25% or more, and the rates above like 3,000 new cases every day. And what also struck me, I moved here about 7 years ago, was that the lack of access to free preventative care. And every time I have to pay something out of pocket, I say, South Carolina is ranked in the top 10 in every preventable disease known to man. And this is not good health care. And I say this when I'm in the doctor's office, talking to my doctors as I'm checking out, because it's baffling to me why. And it's also just hits me in the face every time I have to write a check when I leave the doctor's office, as to why people would not seek preventative care, why you wouldn't go get a physical if you know the office visit's going to cost you $300. And so I find that it angers me so, and I just feel like it's an issue of humanity.
So let's end with and I somehow, oh, there we go. Sorry, I accidentally closed my Q&A. I was trying to open it back up. So we've got about 2 minutes left. And James asks a great question that I think is a good spot, even though I had a bunch of other questions running through my head. James asks one that I think it will nicely bring us back together and close us out for the night. And he asks, what are the social work practice implications of this work? And how does the information from the book inform social work education? So let's throw the practice question over to Carla, not to put you on the spot, but I just did. And then Nikki and I can tackle the education side.
How does this inform practice in South Carolina? Is that the question?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the social work practice implications of this work?
So I think the practice implications are, one, we need to have more social workers, especially in underserved areas. I'm not real sure exactly what the social work presence is in the Black Belt, but that's a huge issue. We need to be fighting for resources for people. We need to be constantly aware that the clients that, of course we know this, that the client sitting in the chair has a different experience than we have, but we need to understand that as best we can. You know, when you look at just, you know, what the educational system the client's been exposed to, what are the job opportunities where the client lives, what is the access to healthcare where the client lives, just kind of what is the culture where the client lives, constantly being aware of it. And I think even if we are clinicians and, you know, that's our main role, we're also still social workers. So we should all be monitoring legislation. There's so many ways to do it. There are apps to do it. There's plenty of ways to keep up with what's happening in the State House, and let your voice be heard. Let your legislator know how you feel about some of the bills that are coming up, especially the ones that are going to be discriminatory against minorities. You know, we have that obligation, and we need to not abandon it.
And as an FYI, the state of South Carolina legislature has an app where you can follow bills, you can get updates on bills, just as you would get a text message alert or alert for anything else that'll pop to your phone. And it's a great tool and resource. And if you want to know the specific name, I will look it up while I toss this to Dr. Wooten to talk about the educational implications, and then I will close us out.
All right, thank you. I think as someone who teaches practice and clinical social work practice in particular, and has a history of practicing in clinical practice, I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are in the classroom to challenge our students when they make assumptions about where people are from. Because if you met Bakari Sellers or saw him on CNN, you would never assume that he was a son of Denmark, from rural Denmark, South Carolina, and that, you know, someone of his stature has overcome great odds of the educational system, of a community where he was surrounded by poverty and those who experienced poverty and disenfranchisement, to overcome all those odds to reach his professional stature, political and professional stature. It is the desire to overcome, the desire to do good, is the desire to represent their community well. And I think when we train our students to meet the client where they are, we have to train them to ask better questions and not make assumptions. I had an experience this morning about a student in my class made an assumption that I would say Richland 2 had the same demographics as a poor urban community school district in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I challenged her stats, like, where did you get that from? Did you think about what the USDA criteria is for, you know, what proportion of students in a school district qualifies for free lunch? What does that say about a community? And what kind of other research can we do as social workers to learn more about the communities that we serve? What the proportion of home ownership, the average, you know, housing? What did that community look like 20 years ago? Has there been sweeping change in not only the demographics, but just overall? Did it go from, you know, just being a rural area to now a suburban area? And so I wanted to challenge those students to consider, are your assumptions correct? And is there evidence to support it? But when we choose to serve a community, we have to learn about those communities.
Thanks, Nikki, for those comments, and also Carla, thank you. I also, I was, you know, Nikki, you said something you wouldn't expect, you know, when you see Bakari on CNN, you wouldn't expect this of him. I also wouldn't have ever guessed that he had all those tattoos. I mean, I was actually surprised. So anyway, just as an FYI, the app, you know, and I downloaded it for my iPhone. If you are in South Carolina, the app is SC, so South Carolina Legislature. So look it up in the App Store and follow the bills. I want to, you know, I just want to thank everyone, in particular Carla and Nikki, for such a rich discussion. We could go on for hours. We're about 4 minutes over, so I'm just going to wind us down. Thank you to those of you who posed questions tonight. We will be using these questions as a basis for the town hall event with Bakari Sellers again next Thursday at 6 to 7 p.m. in the same platform. And so on behalf of Dean Pittner and the College of Social Work at the University of South Carolina, I thank you all for joining us tonight. And let no one be forgotten, be they from the twisted dirt roads of the South the South Side of Chicago, El Paso, Texas, or East Los Angeles. Let no one be forgotten. Thank you and have a great night.